Hello, Leeds. This place has got a lot bigger. I spoke here in 2016, and this was significantly smaller. How many of you here came to the 2016 conference? Can barely see anyone anywhere with these lights, so it doesn't really matter if there are already show of hands or not. But it was significantly smaller back then, so it's awesome to have a really big crowd here. Now, let's see if this clicker is working. In the past 5 years, I've lived in 3 different countries, and during that time, it's kind of given me an appreciation for the nuance of language, needing to localize to different environments, especially in terms of social and business perspectives. I lived in Ireland for just under 2 years, and only recently, about 2 months ago, maybe a little bit more, moved from the US, where I was for 2.5 years, back to London. And one of the things that I did during my time in the US, just to simply make it a lot easier and less confusing for everyone, was I localized the way that I would write. I would write in US English. It took me ages to actually get used to doing this, but it helped with a lot of my colleagues stopping being baffled by my overzealous use of the letter S. And it's really difficult to now retrain back. So I still write color, C-O-L-O-R. I still drop my U's in behavior. I'm a disgrace to our great nation right now. But this very, very small example here of ultimately translation is one small part in a much, much bigger kind of discussion, which is localization. Localization is way, way bigger, and when people think about international SEO and scaling internationally, they often ultimately talk about translation, and in the grand scheme of things, that ends up being the smallest part of the whole process. Localization is much deeper. It takes into cultural differences. It takes into account context, the varying different regions and the different types of people that you're speaking to. And a good example, or a few little examples here, right, is this item. In the UK, we call this a trainer, an overpriced Gucci trainer made to look like an old trainer, but a trainer all the same. In Ireland, I actually prefer this word. It's way more to the point. It does what it says. It's a runner. And in the US, a sneaker. Not quite sure the origins of that. Don't often sneak around in my runners or trainers. Another example. This is a real shit one. Am I right? Tough crowd. Not going to get better than this, guys. Lap it up while you can. So the room that this is kept in, right? In the UK, we'll call that the loo. In Ireland, the bathroom. And in the US, the restroom. When I first moved to the US, I would come and we would go to a bar, and I'd be like, hey, where's the loo? And people would be like, what the hell is the loo? And look at me as if I was some kind of weird alien. And this is an example of different things being called by different names, but then we have words that take on whole different meanings. Football. In the UK, we use that word to describe a sport where, for the majority of the time, you take a round ball and you kick it with a foot. In Ireland, it's used primarily for Gaelic football. And to be fair to Ireland, most of the time, you're kicking a round ball with your foot. And in the US, we have an egg-shaped device that very rarely is it actually kicked with a foot, and that is football. As I was saying, I'm still adjusting to life back in England. It's kind of been really a strange transition where it's felt like I've come back to another country, even though I've grown up here my whole life. And a good example of this, meeting up with friends about 3-4 weeks ago. Lifelong friends, going for a few drinks in the pub, catching up, having some nice flowing discussion, and something came out of me that I'm not proud of. It wasn't on purpose. And I kind of feel quite dirty now. I said the word soccer. It was an honest mistake. From the reaction of the people around me, you would have thought that I just jumped on the table and started burning the Union Jack. There were mothers covering their children's ears, babies were crying. And this is just one very, very small example within English. English is incredibly complex, but nowhere near complex as many other languages. And then when you start thinking about localization from one language to a completely different language, there's so much nuance within there. If you're thinking about targeting Spanish speakers, if anyone here is a Spanish speaker, they'll know that like Spanish has so many variations, it may as well be English to French in terms of a difference, whether you're based in Mexico, Colombia, or Spain itself, incredibly different. You need to be thinking about this from an international SEO point of view. Sometimes language makes absolutely no sense at all. In Swedish, Danish, Dutch, Turkish, Polish, German, Norwegian, Finnish, Latin. Does anybody speak Latin? I do not know. Many more languages. This fruit is known as ananas. I really don't know if I'm actually pronouncing that correctly, which is almost ironic. In English, we call it pineapple. Why? Why do we do that? I don't know. Maybe someone can tell me. Now, moving this into SEO, which is why all of us are here. One of the questions that kind of comes up quite a bit myself is people wondering, okay, do I need to be a polyglot to actually do international SEO effectively? Is there anyone in the room that is a polyglot? Come on, don't act like you don't want to lord this over us mere mortals. Maybe a couple. A polyglot is someone that speaks many different languages, right? You speak 3 languages, you are known as trilingual. If you only speak 2 languages, you're bilingual. Speak 1 language, you're what's known as British. And I'm British, and I've ran a number of successful international SEO campaigns over the years, and alongside this, like, I only speak 1 simple, quite ignorant language. And honestly, I struggle to do that at times. So what I would just say to you is if you're starting on your adventure into international SEO, just remember that if a British person can do this, you stand a chance. Now, moving into the more, like, the meat of the presentation, the biggest takeaway, if I had to say there's one thing I would like for you to take away from this talk, it's that there is not one correct way to do international SEO. This is where the strongest opinions or misinformation is most rife. People will come in and say, well, you know, if you're going to structure a site for international SEO, the most optimal way is to use subdirectories, or subdomains are the worst, or you can't use like top-level domains. They're the worst from a link building point of view, so it doesn't make sense. There is no one correct way. It assumes that all sites are equal. It assumes that all companies are equal. It forgets things like, what is the tech stack? What are the customer base? What are the actual objectives outside of SEO? Not every company just launches a site in a new region because of organic search. So remember this, and I'm going to highlight this in more detail. But let's dig into some specifics around international SEO, stuff that you can come away with and think about and put into action. When you're starting out within international SEO, there are 3 core ways you can build out infrastructure and architecture to support international SEO. The first one of these is, and probably the most simplest implementation, is splitting your site by language. The reason why you would do this is typically you're, amongst many other reasons, to be fair, but your sales process isn't really impacted that much by the country that your customer's based in. And there isn't a huge amount of like country-level demand. So there isn't a huge amount of demand that's different in Spain versus Mexico, but you need to reach Spanish-speaking people, for example. The next is country. And this is ultimately the way that Google is structured, right? On a country-level basis. Google.es, Google Spain, not Google Spanish. This, when you go down this route versus language, this is ultimately when your sales process is impacted by the country customer and the significant country-level demand. And then the final targeting option is country and language, so a combination. And this, you should really only go down this route when you have significant demand within a country and multiple language-speaking groups of customers. So French-speaking Canada and English-speaking Canada, you may have slightly tailored offerings, or you need a different type of messaging for those individuals. When you figured out the targeting options that you take, then you move into the more like structural information architecture. And this is honestly probably the top of the list of where most people get hung up. And the reason is because it's really fucking complicated. And add to that when you've made your decision and you build out your sites using this chosen structure, it's incredibly difficult to change it. And this is where I would say the piece around targeting and then your information architecture is where you need to spend most of your time at the beginning. Get this right at the start, makes everything easier. Get it wrong, and you're going to be living through repairing technical debt that you've created previously. So, first one, 3 different variants here in terms of a technology point of view. So, country code top-level domains, CCTLDs. For example, domain.es, domain.fr. This is a country code top-level domain, not a language code top-level domain. Most common misconception, this is not applicable for language targeting. Domain.es means this domain in Spain, not Spanish, in the exact same way that I said Google operates on a country level. Subdirectories, domain.com/es. That could mean Spanish, it could mean Spain. It can be used for either. And then subdomains, es.domain.com. Similar, can be used for either language or country. Now, if you're doing country plus language, there will be ways that you will use 2 of these implementations at the same time. And I'll come into those examples. But the most important thing is do not mix and match between regions. If you have domain.es that targets all of Spain, and then you have domain.com/fr that targets France, that is not the right way to do this. One implementation, consistent across all your regions. Otherwise, you're just going to run into a ton of problems. So, to prove the point that there is no one correct way, and also showcase the complexity and the different variations of how many types of implementations you have, I'm going to showcase a number of different successful websites from an organic search point of view. By success, they generate a substantial amount of traffic from the search engines across different regions. I'm going to showcase then the different options you can take from an architecture point of view and show that ultimately all of these sites are existing using very different implementations that suit their own business needs. So TripAdvisor, right? They use CCTLD country-based targeting. TripAdvisor.fr, France. TripAdvisor.es, Spain. Then, CCTL country targeting and language targeting. So that's the next example. So if we're going to combine them both. The first part with a CCTLD for the country, wayfair.ca, Wayfair Canada. /FR, you're using a subdirectory then for the language aspect. And then the alternative version, which Airbnb successfully implement, is using a subdomain for the language variant. So you've got FR, French.airbnb.ca, Canada, French-speaking Canada. Now, when would I say is the best time to use CCTLDs, right? You need to have a large audience within each of the countries that you're going after. You're going to need to have resources to maintain all of those individual sites and the ability to get them. There are some real challenges just even having your brand domain name .fr, .es. Either someone might have that already, or in countries like, for example, Brazil, you need to have a registered entity with X amount of revenue that's taxable in Brazil to be able to have a .com.br domain. A lot of people don't think about this at the beginning, and it really comes to bite them on the ass. Actually, a classic example is HubSpot. I'm a complete hypocrite. I'm standing up here like we have huge amounts of technical debt. We operate in Brazil, but we completely forgot or overlooked the fact that we were not able to acquire a .com.br domain, so I had to have a hacky solution. Not everyone's perfect. You want to boost the appearance of a local sales presence, really have like probably the best from a geo-targeting point of view. I'll do a quick comparison grid of these different options in a moment. But we'll be sharing out these slides so you can dig into these in more detail as well. All right, subdirectory, second piece. Language only. You notice there wasn't just a language ccTLD piece because that's focused on countries. Shutterstock, they have .com/pt Portuguese and various other languages. They use a subdirectory for this. Similarly, but very different, Apple, they have subdirectory-based country targeting, apple.com/fr, France, in this respect. They have a ton of countries that they target in there. If you actually go onto the apple.com site, scroll all the way down to the bottom, click Choose Country, and you'll see the massive list. Subdirectory country, and then a language targeting in the same subdirectory. So Microsoft, example, /pt-br, Portuguese-speaking Brazil. These are many different implementations that you can use, and they do get quite complex. I would recommend, when you're thinking about this, have a look through these slides and just explore through their site. So subdirectories, you don't have a huge amount of resources to build and maintain individual sites. You can have one domain, one set of hosting, one instance of your CMS, if it's possible from a tech stack point of view. You don't have the resources for a huge amount of local link building. You can leverage the existing domain and internal linking infrastructure to build more authority. At least it's a bit easier that way. Your products and services don't really differ much by region. You want to keep costs low. It's the lowest cost of an implementation point of view, one hosting, one set of tech stack, one marketing automation tool, etc. And then the last one is subdomains. So we have subdomain language targeting, Yahoo, perfect example. All of their French content they have on fr.yahoo.com. Subdomain country targeting, GlaxoSmithKline, GSK. So they have ca.gsk.com, Canada. And then a subdomain country and language in one subdomain targeting. I generally don't like this kind of implementation, either in subdirectory or subdomain, but it's just because I find it a bit messy. But you've got fr-ca.myprotein.com. That said, it really works for myprotein.com, and they have scaled very successfully this way. So finally, and here's a perfect example of where I struggle to use English. When to use subdomains. So you don't have the resource or ability to acquire and manage all of the individual top-level domains, and generally speaking, more for tech reasons, you're not able to use subdirectories. That's usually when you would go down that route. There is some slight geo-targeting pieces where for every individual country that you target inside a subdomain, you can have a unique IP and hosting related to that in region, which you can't get with subdirectories, which is another kind of minor signal to Google. So very quickly, high-level overview here. I put this together just to kind of show the various trade-offs and where I would see some of these individual options from an architecture point of view, where they excel and where you have some trade-offs. So from a geo-targeting point of view, that is sending those signals to Google that says the content within this site is very much inherently focused on this audience within this region. ccTLDs are the best for this, by far. You have domain.fr, it's clearly, just by default, it is targeting people in France, and it's such a clear signal. What I said with subdomains, where you can at least have an IP that's within France, for example, for fr.domain.com, that's at least second best. Subdirectories is definitely the worst here because there's pretty much nothing you can do outside of like Search Console targeting, which may even be going away. Authority distribution, subdirectories, this is where they're often lauded as the best way to implement international SEO. You can see that that's not necessarily the case here, but having everything in one single, whether it's your .com domain or whatever, makes it a lot easier to push internal links through that single domain. And you can manage things like crawling behavior and indexing a lot easier as a result. Conversion, I would say having that local sales presence feel from a top-level domain is so much more, well, so much better, especially if you're really wanting to make it feel like you have a presence in a specific country. And then architecture. And what I mean by architecture is almost like the ease of building out the architecture. If you have an existing, say, .co.uk site, and you then want to create a version of that in 10 different countries, you can basically just buy up all the ccTLDs and then take the existing folder structure and plonk it straight on. So much easier. It's much trickier when you start getting subdirectories, and it can get very complicated, and sometimes you can have to restructure other things around. And then the final thing is like the maintenance. So subdirectories, like I was saying earlier, one CMS, one hosting package, one single stack, simple. ccTLDs, you have multiple. If you're operating with 30 different countries, multiple different domains, sometimes from different registrars. You have different hosting based in different regions. You then sometimes have to build out individual tech stacks for each region. So it can get very complex. And then the final piece, which brings like fear through many people that have done international SEO before, is hreflang. This is possibly the worst documented aspect of SEO that's ever existed, I think. It is probably the easiest thing to fuck up, which I continually have done throughout my career, which has now meant that I've pretty much done everything wrong with hreflang, so I can never really make a mistake again in the future, which is useful. Now, for those of you that aren't as familiar with what hreflang is, this is a core technical part of international targeting from a search point of view, specifically for Google, but other search engines, I think Bing supports it now as well. hreflang needs to be set up no matter what implementation you go with, whether you choose ccTLDs, subdomains, subdirectories, language, country, you need to have hreflang set up. If you don't, you have an immediate issue that you need to fix. And I would say, like, if that's the case for you right now, I'd put this as like your top priority. It's used to tell Google which pages are the translated or localized versions of the page. So I'll show us an example shortly. You can also, with hreflang, say you can assign like a default page that if you haven't specifically said that there is a page for people in Spain, you can have like a catch-all. It's got an X default tag, which says, OK, this page, just serve up the .com in the search results if they're from this region that's not been specifically specified. Prevents duplicate content across localized content, and this is very easy to mess up. Quick example, right? So here we have domain.com targeting the US, domain.fr targeting France. We have two pages below the home page on this site, page A, page B. They are the localized versions of one another on each of these domains that we have. These purple dashes just denote where hreflang should be pointing to each other. I'll show a quick example of like an implementation, super quick, after this. But for domain.com, you will have a hreflang annotation that says domain.fr. That page is the alternative version. Page A points to fr page A. .com page B points to .fr page B, and vice versa. They always reciprocate. hreflang is done on a page-by-page basis, not a site-wide basis. 3 quick ways that you can implement hreflang. link elements in the head, HTTP headers, XML sitemap annotations. And you can use a few different implementations of this, but you do not need to use more than one per page. So link elements in the head, quick example of what this would look like. Yeah, let's say you have just like a .com, .fr, .es, .com. You just have annotations in there. You can probably, if you're familiar with HTML in any way, you'll see the top line is denoting that this is the page targeting English-speaking US. The alternative, rel equals alternative, version of this for French-speaking France is this, et cetera, and at the bottom we have xdefault, which just shows the .com. So for any other countries or languages that aren't listed here, send them to the .com. HTTP headers only really need to use these for like PDF type file formats. Otherwise, you just push these straight into the head. This is just the format. I'm not going to like run through this in too much detail because you can just reference the slide when you're actually implementing. Simple example. And then XML sitemaps, which, again, I have put an incorrect title on. I've put these in purposefully to just show and reference back that point that I made that I'm terrible at English. This is all planned. So one of the more simple ways to do this that doesn't involve editing any code is just basically baking this into your existing XML sitemap. So you have LOC, which is like the actual page that this is referencing in the sitemap. And then for every XHTML link, rel equals alternative in the exact same way, you have below it each of the alternative versions of the page. Few quick things, and this is probably the most important part for hreflang. Then we'll finish up, and everyone can eat and be happy and awake again. Rule 1. Content does not need to be an exact translation of a page to have a hreflang assigned to it. If you have completely different pricing pages for one region to another, it's fine. You're telling Google, this is the content that people are looking for in France that's the alternative version of this page. Apple, perfect example, their US version, they have a US-specific offer. In Australia, they have an Australia-specific offer. These two have hreflang to one another. They're the alternative versions. They're not exactly the same. You only need to add hreflang on pages where you actually have an alternative version. Like, if this is our example, and we don't have a page B on domain.fr, you don't add a hreflang tag. It's fine. It's page by page. So you can have some pages having hreflang, other pages not. Absolutely fine. That's the way it should be. And this is probably the most common error that will get thrown. If you are pointing to different pages with hreflang, they have to the exact same code snippet. Let's say if we're doing a head implementation, the exact same code snippet is on every single page. So if we have domain.com/page A, domain.es/page A, domain.fr/page A, they're each alternatives. This exact code is on all three. If it's only on one, it will not work. It needs to be reciprocal across every single variant of that page. But you should only add it to the canonical of the page. And we're getting really in the weeds right now, I know. And there is an exception, just to make this even more complicated, with AMP URLs, where you do not add to the canonical. But a quick example here. This is how not to do it. If domain.com/page A has a canonical link that points to page B, and you have your hreflang pointing from .com page A over to page A, that will not work. Because Google will look at the canonical and say, OK, well, page B is the real version of this page. I'm going to ignore page A, and I'll ignore anything after that, which is hreflang. What you should have is, you can absolutely have canonicals working at play here, is the domain.com/page B having the hreflang, because that's the canonical version of the page, pointing to page A. Now, I said there's an exception with AMP. AMP, you still have to add the hreflang to the AMP version of the URLs. There's some really confusing and poorly written documentation from Google that you can look up to learn more about that. And then finally, you can use xdefault to state the version of the page to be shown to all languages and countries not specifically listed. If you only have a version of the page for the UK and for France, you don't need to list every single country in the world in your hreflang, which I have close to seen that in some pages that just points to the .co.uk version. You can just put xdefault, says, if I don't have specific targeting for this country that this user comes from in the search engines, just use this as the default one. So this is what it looks like. That little bottom tag looks very similar to the rest of the annotations. Again, has to be on every version of the page, follows all the other rules, and just has xdefault. Final piece here, and a final reminder, there is not one correct way to do international SEO. Hopefully this has given you a good primer. Hopefully you've learned a little bit. Dig into the slides. I know there's a lot to absorb. And if you want to find me, go check out what we're writing on HubSpot. You can find me on Traffic Think Tank. Twitter, if you have any questions, I'll answer them. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the day.